Son of a Puritan immigrant, a soap maker in Boston. And being the 10th child, his father was going to make him the tithe to the Lord and send him to Harvard to study for the ministry. Harvard was then the type of place, back then at least, that churned out ministers. Franklin was not exactly cut for the cloth, however. He was a cheeky kid, and he was around age 12 or so when this was coming up. And they were salting away the provisions for the winter. And young Benjamin said to his dad, "Why don't I say grace over him right now, once and for all? We can get it done for the year, and we won't have to do it again." So his father decided it'd be a waste of money, as indeed it would have been, to send him to Harvard, which was probably the best thing for him, because he was able to develop an inventive, experimental, practical mind and teach himself. He got himself apprenticed to his older brother at the print shop in Boston and the newspaper there, and decided he was going to teach himself history. So he read Plutarch's Lives and St. Aquinas and Defoe, all those books you and I were reading when we were 12 years old, and came up with a real feeling that history is made by people, the real theme of Plutarch's Lives. He also wanted to become a writer, so he pulled down from the shelf the volumes of The Spectator, which was a great London magazine of the time, from his brother's print shop in Boston, and he read the essays of Addison and Steele, and he'd take notes, and then put the notes aside and mix them up a bit, and then go back to them a few days later and see if he could recreate the essay, and then compare it with the original and correct it where he hadn't done as well. He said, but every now and then I'd compare it and find that maybe in a few particulars I had done just as well as the original authors, or even a little bit better, and it made me think that I could become a tolerable writer. Well, not only does he become a tolerable writer, but he becomes the best, the most popular, the most accessible, and certainly the funniest writer of the century in America, the 18th century. And he develops a sort of spunky conversational style of humor, which becomes quintessentially American, a style of humor in which characters sort of play that fake, naive role, but poke fun at the pretensions of the powerful and the elite, sort of the Mark Twain, Will Rogers. You can see it throughout our history. Of course, he wanted to do that and use it in his brother's newspaper, but some of you may know how older brothers are, and this was quite jealous. James Franklin did not let him write for the newspaper. So Benjamin Franklin disguised his handwriting, invented a pseudonym called Silence Dogood, and here he is at this point, 15 years old, a very spunky and sort of ill-behaved young lad in Boston. Never had left the city, never been out of the city, but he's writing under the pseudonym of a widowed woman living in the countryside of Massachusetts who had been married to a minister and was being courted, somewhat ridiculously, by another minister. And it's a triumph of the imagination. But you also see in these Silence Dogood papers, letters that he wrote for his brother's newspaper, all the sort of values and ideas and virtues that become what Franklin tries to imbue in the American character. The very first Silence Dogood, she introduces herself and she says, I'm exceedingly jealous of each of our rights, and I hate any form of tyranny. Any trampling of our rights makes our blood boil exceedingly. That's why we're Americans. And then in his funniest Silence Dogood, he attacks Harvard, because his friends were starting to go there, and about being the type of place that only turns out dunces and blockheads who know how to enter a room genteelly. And then she notes it's something that they could better have learned just by going to dancing school. And there's a wonderful ad about 4 or 5 weeks into Silence Dogood's run, in which there's an ad that says, if anybody knows the identity of Silence Dogood or how we can reach her, please tell James Franklin, the printer within, or something. But finally he figures out it's his brother. And to cut to the chase, they don't get along all that well, and he runs away to this wonderful town of Philadelphia. Probably the most famous scene in autobiographical literature. He wanders into town, lands on Market Street, bedraggled, wet, walks up Market Street. He's only got a few coins in his pocket. He uses one of them to tip the boatman, another to buy those 3 puffy rolls that are sort of the famous icon of him coming into Philadelphia. He gives one of the rolls to a poor, hungry woman who was on the boat with him. And he says, by the way, when you're very, very poor, you tend to be more generous than when you're rich, because you don't want people to think you're poor, and so you just pretend to be more generous. And that to me is quintessentially Franklin, because here he is caring about his image, but somehow the image and the reality all blend together. A very generous man, a man very into philanthropy, caring about what it's right to be virtuous, but also giving the great appearance of virtue. And he even develops a list of 12 virtues because he's intent on creating something that they didn't have in England, which was a really solid middle class of upstanding and successful tradesmen, artisans, shopkeepers, printers, and stuff, who would be the backbone of a new society and of a new democracy. He very much believed you couldn't have a democracy unless you had a stable middle class. And so a lot of what he writes is there to inculcate virtue, as he puts it, in the middle class. And he wrote the first great self-help, How to Succeed in Business book, which is half a How to Succeed in Business, the other half being sort of a How to Win Friends and Influence People. In fact, Dale Carnegie and Stephen Covey, the two great gurus of the How to Win Friends and How to Succeed in Business genres, both truly cite Franklin and use Franklin a lot in their works. And in doing so, Franklin lists the 12 virtues that the tradesmen of Philadelphia should have and that he should have. Industry, frugality, diligence, that sort of thing. And he marks them on a chart. He's a very methodical man and wants to see each week, can he conquer and master one of these virtues. He puts a little mark every time he fails. He said at a certain point he had put so many marks and erased them that he was eating through the paper. So he transfers it to a slate so he can wipe it clean each week and try again each week. And finally, he comes up with a good clean slate of having mastered these virtues. That's where the cliche comes from. And he shows it around to his friends in his discussion club and his friends in Philadelphia. And one of his friends here, a Quaker, as he put it, kindly informed him that he had left out a virtue. And Franklin says, "What's that?" And the friend says, "Humility. You might want to try to practice that one." And Franklin, being wry and somewhat self-deprecating, of course, puts humility as the 13th virtue on his list. He said, "I was never able to conquer that virtue. I was never really able to master it. But I was able to give the appearance of humility. I could fake it very well." And here's the quintessential Franklin again. And he says, and this is a whole part of his life, that the appearance of humility was actually just as useful as the reality of that virtue, because it made you listen to other people. It made you care about what they think, be willing to find common ground with them, compromise, not assert yourself too much. And that was the essence of what we needed to build a democracy here. And I often think when I was at Time magazine, right after the Bush election, I went down to Crawford because we were interviewing him and stuff. He went on and on about the need for humility in foreign policy. Well, I mean, I can understand after 9/11 the need for a more aggressive foreign policy, perhaps. But I do feel that if he could just learn a bit from Franklin and they could fake a little bit of humility in the foreign policy, we might have the support of our allies just a little bit better. Franklin, as he came into Philadelphia, very famously, he's laughed at by Deborah Reed on Market Street. And eventually, of course, ends up marrying Deborah Reed, as you might expect. It was a common law marriage because she had been married once before and her husband had run away. But it turned out to be a very practical, pragmatic marriage. He said he could have sought a wife who brought a big dowry and some money into it, but instead he got something far more valuable, which was a frugal, industrious wife who could be his partner and help run the print shop and stuff. They were about as different as you can be, and one of the things that attracted me to Franklin is that he's got real flaws. This is a flesh and blood person, so you're not dealing with, George Washington in marble. You're dealing with a person who you can say, gee, we can learn something from him, and, including how he wrestled with some of his flaws, because his marriage was not very romantic. It was not very passionate or deep, but it was very solid in terms of being a partnership. As far as I can tell in my research, she sees him on Market Street that first day. Eventually they get married. She lives on Market Street. He rents rooms in her mother's house. They eventually rent a house of their own. Then they build the house on Market Street, which all of y'all have probably seen. As far as I know, she never spent not only a night away from Philadelphia, but a night away from Market Street her whole life. She hated to travel. He loved to travel. When he became a successful printer, those of us at AOL Time Warner can relate to this, he felt, he had a printing shop where he wanted to franchise it. So he built printing shops up and down the colonies, so he had a chain of them in which he had a 50% equity stake. He needed the content, so he had the newspaper he started, then started a magazine, distributed the content and had it sold through the various printing shops, invents Poor Richard's Almanac, mainly because he wants to sell books. As he puts it in Poor Richard with all those famous Poor Richard's maxims that are designed to help tradesmen, early to bed and early to rise, something he never quite followed his life, and penny saved is a penny earned. He said, you may think I'm doing this to help create virtue among our great tradesmen and give them the advice on how to succeed, which of course was half true, but he said, but in reality, the reason I'm doing this is because my wife is threatening to kick me out of the house if I don't make some more money with all of my preachings, and so, and all my contraptions and rattling traps, so I'm doing this almanac, and I hope you'll buy it and save my marriage. So he's kind of funny about it all, but he has this wonderfully practical marriage. We're wrestling with a real human being here, including his son. He had a son, William, illegitimate son, William, born right before the common law marriage starts. But unlike most men of the day, he takes total responsibility for William, brings him in, raises him, educates him, whatever. They have a very loving, close relationship, but William begins to become aristocratic, especially when they go to England, where Franklin is an envoy for this colony trying to fight the Penn family taxation policies. And Franklin is a firm believer in the middle-class shopkeeping values and doesn't want a class system brought into this country. His son William, however, becomes aristocratic, fancy, wearing wigs, carriages, hanging around with the dukes and the earls and stuff. And in fact, I think most scholars think, one of the motives for the autobiography, the scene I talked to you about of him straggling into Philadelphia, that autobiography begins with two words, dear son. And it's a remember your roots, remember where you come from. Remember that we're trying to form a new nation here based on people proud to be workers and proud to be shopkeepers, not proud to be part of a non-working aristocracy. But anyway, they have this somewhat complex relationship, but very loving, until 1775. By that point, William's the royal governor of New Jersey, and Franklin comes back to the United States, having failed to avert the revolution, and casts his lot with the American patriots on the side of independence, and has a summit meeting right near here in Bucks County with his son, the governor, royal governor, and asks him to join in the rebel cause in favor of independence, and his son doesn't. So they have this great political and personal split and barely speak again the rest of their lives. Making it even more of a soap opera is the fact that William had had his own illegitimate son, who by then was a beautiful young lad named Temple Franklin. And Temple had not been taken in by his father William. His father William hadn't taken real responsibility for him. And Benjamin Franklin, the grandfather, had raised Temple. And at this point in 1775, there's a great tug-of-war for the soul and the loyalty of young Temple. And Temple ends up siding with the grandfather, Benjamin Franklin, becoming a rebel patriot and working alongside his grandfather. So there's a great family struggle that's part of this political struggle as well. He retired from printing, well, before 1775, I'll back up a bit, but after becoming a successful printer here, he retires in order to devote himself to civic associations, civic duties, the life of the mind and stuff. His mother's a little bit baffled, but he writes her back and says, I'd rather have it be said of me that I lived usefully than that I died rich. And among the many civic associations he did, we know about the library and the Constable Corps, the hospital, everything else, but of course the greatest was probably the academy that becomes this great university. And even though I relegate some of this to a footnote because my editor told me it was boring, I'll bore you with it because I find it quite interesting. The difference in meritocratic philosophy between Thomas Jefferson, who adored Franklin, they were very close to one another, 40 years younger, but a protege, a man of the Enlightenment and reason and science, just like Franklin, and Benjamin Franklin. Jefferson forms the University of Virginia, And in the founding documents of the University of Virginia, he talks about the need that we don't want to recreate the old aristocracy based on birth, but we want to create a new aristocracy. We want to filter out the most talented people, young people, and pick them early on and filter them out from the masses and create a new elite or a new aristocracy who will be the rulers of the country. Franklin strongly disagreed, and even though he too believed in a meritocracy rather than an aristocracy, his was a different definition of it. And you should read, and I don't know if, Madam President, you make them do it, but you should read the founding document of this university, the Proposals for the Education of the Youth of Philadelphia or of Pennsylvania, in which he talks about that the importance of education is to help every aspiring person, every aspiring young person do better and move society up, because everybody in society can benefit from a great education. And you do not want to create a new elite, but you want to have a university that's engaged in real life and the real world and help people of all walks of life, not just the well-born and the well-educated, but of all walks of life who could benefit and create a better society by having education. And I do think that the University of Pennsylvania, which I've studied quite a bit, has over the years truly lived up to that ideal, and that's what has made it one of the great universities in the world. Franklin, by the time he comes back in 1775, he's trying to put these ideals into action. He's asked to be part of the committee that drafts the Declaration of Independence. It was probably the only good committee I've ever heard of. It was Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and a couple of others, but those were the three who actually worked on it. And Jefferson got to write the first draft of the Declaration, much to John Adams' chagrin. Adams was somewhat jealous and not quite as close to Jefferson as Franklin was. And he does it in a rented room a few doors away from Franklin's home on Market Street here, and he sends it down the block after he does the first draft. He said, "Will the good Dr. Franklin, in his infinite wisdom and great brilliance, do anything he possibly can to improve this document?" I was thinking, when I read that, how much nicer people were to editors back then than they were when I was one. And Franklin reads it, and he sees that wonderful second paragraph, which Jefferson at least had begun. "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." And Franklin takes the old black pen that he used as a printer, you can see it's wonderful, and did the backslashes the way we do when we edit stories, when we take something out, and changed it. "We hold these truths to be self-evident." And he explained, both to Adams, Jefferson, and others, when it was discussed, that they were creating a new type of nation, one whose rights of the people depended on the consent of the governed, were not handed down as divine rights, and where rationality and reason were the ones who, the way we did creating a new nation. And I think it came from that experimental mentality of his. He was a great scientist at the time, had discovered the single fluid theory of electricity and put it to practical use with lightning rods. And he was always saying, let's not be ideological, let's not worry about received dogma. This is why he ran away from Puritan Boston. He felt that that a religion based on received dogma was less useful, as he put it, to society than a religion or a political philosophy or a science based on evidence of what works. And he said the one question we always have to ask is what works, what's practical, what's most pragmatic. And you see that throughout. You see it when he goes to France, and he's our ambassador there, trying to get France in on our side in the revolution. He was the last diplomat we ever had who knew how to deal with France, and but he goes there as, other than Jerry Lewis, probably the most famous and revered person we've ever sent to France. His book, Poor Richard's Almanac and The Way to Wealth, had been translated and was a bestseller there under the name Le Science de Bonhomme Richard. And his electricity experiments had first been, or the lightning experiments had first been performed in France under the directions that he had given. So he was by far the most famous, world citizen in France at that time. And he plays it up, once again, a great image maker, because he's a brilliant balance of power diplomat, up there with Metternich and Kissinger in terms of knowing how to balance the strategic interests of France, and writes a memo to Vergennes explaining the Bourbon Pact nations, France's relations to Spain, the Netherlands, and Flanders versus the relationship with England and why it's important to come in on the war. But he knew, unlike this administration, that the strength of our foreign policy not just comes from asserting our strategic interests, but also holding true to our values and the people sharing our values around the world. So he wants people in France to share the values. He sets up a printing press and prints the Declaration of Independence and the other great documents they had done and distributes them throughout France. And he also knows that they're revering liberty, equality, Rousseau's natural rights, and Rousseau's natural man. And so he almost pretends, as somebody who's never really lived anywhere other than big cities, Philadelphia, Boston, and London, to be the frontier philosopher and the frontier sage. Instead of wearing the powdered wigs and the ceremonial robes, he arrives in Paris for his great meeting on the steps of the Académie Royale with Voltaire. He's wearing a fur cap and a backwoods coat, a fur cap he had picked up on his one trip out to the frontier. But he's trying to show, Rousseau's natural man and embrace these values of the French. And the French, of course, totally adore it. The women start wearing coiffure à la Franklin, which is hair done as if it were a fur cap. And everybody's wearing these cameos and medallions of Franklin that had been struck. But he finally gets France in on a side on the Revolution, a very important thing. They supply 90% of the gunpowder. He recruits Lafayette, who has more French troops at the decisive Battle of Yorktown than Washington has American troops. And it's a great success. He comes home and is sort of the glue that holds together the Constitutional Convention. Many of our founders were men of great principle, unbending, unyielding in terms of the principles they believed in. John Adams, Sam Adams, among others, and others were great, noble, revered figures, almost unapproachable, like a George Washington. But what you also need in a great leadership team is a person who actually makes it all work and pull together. As they were pulling apart in that hot summer of Philadelphia, 1787, and they were about to come apart on the big state, small state issue, proportional representation, single representation by state. Franklin finally gets up. The Connecticut Compromise had failed, whatever, and it looked like it was all going to come apart. He gets up and he makes the motion for having a House and a Senate, and just dividing it. And he says, when we were young tradesmen and we wanted to make a joint that would hold together, and it didn't quite fit, you'd shave a little from one side and take a little from the other side, and you finally had a joint that would hold together for centuries. And so too we at this convention must each part with some of our demands and each be willing to admit that we might be fallible and others might understand things as well as we do. Say he was 40 years older than the average age of everybody else there, twice as old, and he said, the older I get, the more I realize that sometimes I'm fallible, which is why I'm willing to compromise. And he said, compromisers may not make great heroes, but they do make great democracies. And in the end, he's able to get everybody, or almost everybody there, to agree to the compromises, line up and sign the document. That's when he makes his famous statement about the sun on the back of Washington's chair and saying, I often wonder whether it was a rising or setting sun, and now I know it's a rising sun. And he comes out into the streets, right near the State House, and Mrs. Pownell, a grand old lady of this town, says, what have you wrought in there? What have you given us? And he says, a republic, madam, if you can keep it. And he really was the one who believed that it was up to the people to take a true democracy and keep it strong. The one thing that they compromised there, and that was a compromise in Franklin's life for a time, was the issue of slavery. And when you deal with the founders, you got to wrestle with the issue of slavery. When you deal with this country, you have to wrestle with the issue of slavery, which is why it makes Franklin all the more interesting, because he wrestled with it badly. He had owned 2 slaves for part of his life. He'd allowed the newspaper here that he had, the Pennsylvania Gazette, to carry advertisements for slavery. And he realized after a while that in a lifetime spent fighting tyranny, and any trampling of the rights of any of my fellow citizens makes my blood boil exceedingly, as Silence Dogood had said at age when he was 15, that he had compromised himself and he had done wrong. And of course, he had freed his slaves, insisted his family do so. But even those of you in Philadelphia have to realize that 10% of this city in 1787 were slaves. It was not just something of South Carolina farmers or whatever. And so the last thing he does at age 82 or 83 is he becomes president of the Society for the Abolition of Slavery. And not only that, it's not just the abolition of slavery, but he realizes that with 700,000 slaves out of a population of 4 million, you have to have schools and employment opportunities. And he forms all these committees and subcommittees to try to create the groundwork for abolition and to allow the integration of a new economy and a new society. He makes a great impassioned plea to Congress to abolish slavery. And a Georgia congressman gets up and lambasts him, just eviscerates him, and makes a speech about how abolishing slavery will destroy the economy, and plus we've brought people from Africa over here and it's to their advantage, they learn Christianity, that sort of thing. And Franklin, on his deathbed, wrote the last piece he ever wrote and published. And just like the very first piece he had written 70 years earlier, As Silence Do Good, it was a parody, it was a hoax. It was a speech that he said he had found that had been given 100 years earlier in the Divan of Algiers, the Algerian parliament, by a leader in Algiers, who was defending the need and the right and the morality of enslaving white European Christians to work in Algeria, and how it helped them to see the light of Muhammad and how it helped the economy. It was scathing and brilliant and funny, and it ridiculed and humiliated Congressman Jackson of Georgia. And it became one of the first, one of the founding documents, really, of the abolition movement. It was that tolerance and that notion of admitting he was wrong and might be fallible that, to me, is the most important thing he gave to our nation, because it was not something inherent in either the Puritan doctrine or in Jonathan Edwards or Cotton Mather. It's not necessarily inherent in our life today, and it's certainly not inherent in our world today, the notion of good-natured religious and tribal tolerance. In fact, the problems we face in this century, the same as they faced then, and it still needs the type of virtues Franklin had. During his lifetime in this city, he donated to the building fund of each and every church erected in the city. And when they built the new hall, right next to Carpenter's Hall, which was supposed to be a venue or place that itinerant preachers could come, he wrote the pamphlet to get people to contribute. And he said, even if the Mufti of Constantinople were to send somebody here to preach Mohammed to us, we should give that person a pulpit and we should be willing to listen. And just before he died, he was the largest donor to the Mikveh Israel Synagogue, the first synagogue here in Philadelphia. And usually when you die and you move from that place on Market Street to the graveyard right next to the church there on 2nd Street, your minister accompanies your casket to the grave. But at Franklin's funeral, the largest such gathering that had ever happened in the colonies up until then, all 35 ministers of the city of Philadelphia and the rabbi of the Jews linked armed and marched arm in arm with his casket to the grave. And so when people say, why do you do Franklin, or what's the importance of Franklin today, it is that notion of tolerance and that notion of fallibility and that sense of humility, or at least being willing to fake some humility, that we need so much more in this world, in our politics, in our national life, our civic life, and in our world today.